Hello everyone, that music again is Schaffen sich erweiden by J.S. Bach, performed by Marco Cera. And this is Sam Biagetti of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. And this video is Red, White, and Royal Blue, a historian's analysis. Part 1. We really need to get you a book on English history, the historical context of Red, White, and Royal Blue. I already posted a couple of months ago an introductory video sort of laying out my case for why I think this movie, Red, White, and Royal Blue, is interesting and revealing and merits and rewards a great deal of analysis. I argued it has an especially dense web of metaphor, symbolism, and allusion, and that it can serve as a reflection on our time, on politics, on aesthetics, film. But my own field, of course, is history. That's where I'm coming from. And so I'm going to start off the first actual part now with a commentary on the historical context, which includes, in many cases, actual specific references and allusions to historical figures or events in the movie, but also includes a lot of history that kind of surrounds the movie, that gives it meaning and resonance, that the authors, like the book author Casey McQuiston or Matthew Lopez, who directed the film, may or may not have been consciously aware of, but nonetheless that gives depth and meaning to this story. There are many different places one could start talking about the historical context of this movie. There are many possible lines of attack, but as I've said, I think that this movie functions on one level as an allegory and as a variation on the international theme, the long-running theme of the differences in the relationship between America and the Old World, and especially America and Great Britain. And these characters function on one level as symbols of their respective countries and even their respective governments. So I'm going to start by going back to a scene that I talked about briefly in the introductory video, and that encapsulates a lot of the symbolic freight of this movie. And as I said before, it was the first scene that I saw because it started circulating online, like on Twitter, causing comment and conversation. It sort of captured people's imaginations. And I think there are a lot of reasons why it does. And that is the so-called lake or dock scene. So if you've seen the movie, and this video is intended for people who have seen it, right? There will be spoilers and all kinds of references that won't make sense unless you've seen it. But this scene is pivotal in the story of the personal relationship, the affair between Alex and Henry. It's the first sort of rupture in the relationship. It's the first point when the relationship threatens to possibly collapse or end. And it takes place on a floating dock, or you could even say a sort of artificial floating island in the middle of a lake. And it begins with a view from above of just Henry alone, reclining on this floating dock. Then we see Alex enter the frame swimming towards the dock. He climbs out, he approaches Henry, and in a sort of gag move, he shakes his head and sprays water over Henry's body, which is maybe my favorite moment in the whole movie because it's so revealing of the character and the personality, and it has many levels of symbolism. Just for one thing, most obviously, it's very dog-like, and as I talked about in the introduction, there's this interesting parallel set up between Alex and Henry's dog named David. There are hints and suggestions that Alex is going to take up the role of guardian and companion and in that way replace David. But there are many other layers you could see of political, sexual symbolism to this moment. Then Alex reclines down next to Henry, and he starts talking about his hopes for the future of their relationship. He wants it to continue and develop. Eventually, it seems, become public. And Henry he's uncomfortable. He turns away from Alex. And many people, if you watch reaction videos to the movie, many people actually foresee what's happening here, which is that this is becoming too intense for Henry. The stakes are too high, and he panics. He literally hurls himself into the lake and swims away to shore. And subsequently, he goes back home to Britain and cuts off communication with Alex. So this is a dramatic moment, but it's one that makes a lot of sense and is even, you could say, predictable. based on the trajectory that we've seen of this affair and these two characters. The question then is if you could say, well, this sort of scene where the relationship is put to the test and starts to break, this was very foreseeable. It's almost, you could say, built into the formula. Why is it so compelling? Specifically, why does it take place where it does? Why does this all happen on this little floating dock in the middle of a lake? And clearly this was important because it must have been very difficult to film. I don't see how they filmed this. Like, just to begin with, in these overhead scenes, I don't understand where the camera is. Is it on a crane? Is it on a drone? Is it hanging from a tree? I don't know. And it must have been incredibly complicated to film this. But clearly there's a great deal of symbolism built into where and how the scene unfolds. So it happens on this floating dock in a lake. Why? Why is that so important? Well, on one level, we have to remember that this is a story about an affair between two men, one American and one British, and both of whom are very much pulled into and tied into the politics of their respective countries. And we're constantly made aware of this divide, this literal and figurative gulf between them, with ensconced in their two countries facing each other from across the North Atlantic. And these two men have to have this sort of clandestine affair, seeing each other when they can, constantly having to crisscross back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. And, you know, as some people have sort of joked, this affair produces a lot of carbon emissions. But this is clearly part of the formula and the drama of the story. And so the lake can be seen on one level as standing in for the Atlantic Ocean. This body, this literal body of water separating these two men. And that also represents the gulf between their worlds, their societies, their responsibilities. So then what does the floating dock represent? Well, on an abstract level, you could say it represents the small island of intimacy that these two men have to construct and share between themselves in the middle of this gulf. And there's a lot of tension in it because on one level, it's private and intimate. They're alone there on this little floating island, but at the same time, it's completely exposed. Anyone on shore, going by on a boat, would be able to see them. There's no real privacy. There's a sort of glass illusion of privacy. And it's significant that we see Henry here first. So you could say on one level, Henry has constructed a private world for himself, a world of private feelings and memories and sentiment. Alex then approaches and enters that world temporarily, but after not too long, Henry panics and leaves. Now, also you could say that the floating dock, on a more concrete level, symbolizes the island of Great Britain, which is where Henry lives, where he has built this public and private life for himself, and again, where Alex intrudes in and is allowed into Henry's world briefly, but then it falls apart. And when Henry swims away, he then subsequently sneaks out and boards a plane back to the actual literal island of Great Britain, where Alex again then has to pursue after him and intrude into his world in Kensington Palace. And you may notice that Alex shows up to Kensington Palace completely wet, almost as if he had jumped in and swum across after Henry. So the lake scene, coming almost right in the middle of the movie here, can be seen again to encapsulate a lot of the symbolism that these characters are charged with and the sort of historical and political stakes of their affair, which can be taken to represent this sort of fragile and fraught connection between Britain and America, these two countries that in theory share a common language, a great deal of common history, but also have a history of conflict and contention and a relationship that is always fraught and ambiguous. So a lot of this video is just going to be trying to unpack and examine this relationship and the way it's represented in the movie. And I'm going to talk about these characters a lot as symbols, as historical and political symbols. But I want to be careful to say I do not want to reduce these characters to merely being symbols. Part of why this movie works so well, I think, is that the characters actually function both as symbols and as believable real people at the same time, right? Which is a very difficult feat to pull off, and I think that this movie does it. But I'm going to talk first now about the symbolism that surrounds these characters And if I talk about their personalities, it's going to be as it relates to their symbolic roles. Okay, so let's say that we start first by talking about Henry and how he relates to the history and symbolism of the British monarchy. So once again, in order to unfold this, I'm going to again go back to the lake scene because, as I said, the lake can be taken to represent the Atlantic Ocean and hence the distance between these two people and their countries. But also, it is very significant that on the literal level, it is actually a lake. This does not take place on a beach on the ocean. They're not in Key West or Provincetown or whatever. They're on a lake. And that is important because lakes in European folklore and mythology, and especially in Great Britain, lakes are traditionally understood as gateways to the other world, the spirit world. They hence serve as conduits of connection from that sort of invisible realm to the earthly realm, and specifically to kings and rulers. And this is embodied most of all and most familiarly to a modern audience in the Arthurian mythology, which I've talked about before in this podcast. In the Arthur story, as it developed in the Middle Ages, we see the lake serving as this well, this font of otherworldly power and authority, which is connected directly to Arthur and his kingship. Remember, why is Arthur able to rule, or what is the symbol of his rule? It's his sword Excalibur, which is bestowed upon him by the Lady of the Lake. And this sort of connection is woven into the story of Red, White, and Royal Blue. And it's right there almost from the beginning, but in a very subtle way. As we discussed before, Henry is in a state of sort of extended mourning and unresolved grief for his father, who died several years previously and whose name is Arthur. And I certainly do not think that is an accident or a mistake. On one level, anyone writing about the British monarchy is bound to have the symbolism of Arthur in the back of their mind. And many historical monarchs, like Edward III, very intentionally invoked Arthur the Round Table Excalibur as symbols of their authority and their legitimacy. And it's no coincidence, too, that Henry's father, who is named Arthur, is deceased and that there's this lingering sadness and grief around him because Arthur, as we know, is also a tragic figure who presided over a brief golden age and then fell from power. And moreover, he falls from power because of a series of incidents which begins with a clandestine love affair, specifically a clandestine love affair between his wife Guinevere and his closest friend and best fighter named Lancelot. And I think that a connection, a parallel is hinted here between the Lancelot character who sleeps with Guinevere or has at least a love affair with Guinevere in the Arthurian mythos, and our character of Alex, whom we see emerging from the lake. So Lancelot, in the earliest appearances where he comes into the Arthurian romances in the 12th century, he's called Lancelot du Lac, meaning of the lake or from the lake. And we learn that he was actually raised in this sort of mystical other world by the Lady of the Lake. And he is, in this way, he springs from the same well as Excalibur and Arthur's otherworldly authority as king. And he emerges from the lake and he approaches and joins Camelot, where he rises to prominence. He joins the Round Table. He becomes the foremost fighter, but then he disrupts the state and the whole system by his love for Guinevere. And Alex, too, is this sort of dangerous, destabilizing element who emerges not literally from under the lake, but he emerges from this other country, from America on the other side of the ocean. And he engages in a love affair with Henry, a family member of the king and a member of the royal family like Guinevere. And you can even see there are parallels and similarities even in the physical descriptions, where in the romances, Lancelot is described as tall and strong with a broad chest, curly hair, and a brunette or light brown complexion. Now, before I go any further, some of you might note, well, didn't I already argue in the introductory video that there's a parallel set up between Alex and the biblical King David? And yes, there is that as well. And that, again, I think is not just a coincidence. In fact, you can see, looking at the Arthurian mythos as it developed in the 12th, 13th centuries and as we know it today, there's a remarkable parallel between that storyline of the love affair that undid Camelot and the biblical story of the rise of King David, his love affair with Jonathan, and his eventual overthrow and replacement of Saul. So in both of those stories, in the Arthur story and in the David story, we have a king who is arguably a tragic king who is not able to found a lasting dynasty. In the biblical story, that's Saul. In the Arthurian mythos, of course, that's Arthur. Then they have a family member or loved one within the royal household whom they trust. In the biblical story, that is Saul's son Jonathan. In the Arthur mythos, it is Guinevere. Then you have the sort of best fighter who rises to prominence and becomes a kind of challenger to the king. That being in the biblical story, David, and in the Arthur story, it's Lancelot. And then moreover, this sort of best fighter who comes to challenge and destabilize the system also embarks on his own quest. He has a vision or a quest. And for David, in the biblical story, that is to build a temple to God at Jerusalem. And for Lancelot, it is to attain the Holy Grail. And there are parallels and links you can see between the Temple of Jerusalem and the Holy Grail. And in both cases, they are not able to attain that quest because of their own flaws and moral limitations. But it ultimately is taken up and fulfilled by their son, who is more pure at heart than they are. So for the biblical story, that is David's son Solomon, who eventually does build the temple. And in the Arthurian mythos, that is the son of Lancelot, Sir Galahad. So all of this, I think you can see resonating in an arguably very subtle way in Red, White, and Royal Blue, right? Where we have this king, James III, who is clearly flawed, who represents the past, who is outmoded. He is grooming his grandson, Henry, to carry on his legacy. Henry then engages in a clandestine love affair with Alex, who has these parallels and resonances with both David and Lancelot. And then what happens after that? Well, we don't know. But, if you were to carry the parallel further, I would say perhaps Alex at some point takes up some quest. We know he's ambitious and driven. He wants to be a leader, but he's unable to complete it. Maybe it's carried on by a child, perhaps a child he has that he raises with Henry. Who knows? Just throwing things out there. But the question that might come to our mind now, of course, is, well, is this intentional? Is this just accidental similarities and parallels? Are these allusions conscious? And the answer is, I don't know. I don't know whether Casey McQuiston or Matthew Lopez was thinking consciously about these allusions and these parallels. But I think it's clear the influence is there, right? This type of story of this sort of rise and fall of a king, the new generation, the love affair that disrupts the old system, all of this is, I think, clearly carried through, whether consciously and intentionally or not. Just as when we look at the Arthurian romances, we can't say, well, did Chrétien de Troyes and these other romance writers, were they intentionally patterning their story on David and Jonathan, or is it an accident? We don't know, but they read the Bible. They knew these biblical stories. It's clear the influence is there. And likewise, Casey and those who adapted the movie, they knew the Arthurian mythology. They know about Lancelot and Guinevere. And it's clearly factoring in some way, even if it was unconscious. And the fact that we have this character looming in the background of the whole story, whose name is Arthur, shows that really no one today could write about the British monarchy without having on some level the Arthur story in their mind and all of its implications for the meaning of kingship and the meaning of power and authority. Now, more specifically, this reference, this allusion that I think you can see to the Arthurian mythos, it underscores a basic reality that really conditions this whole story, which is that when you're talking about royalty, the personal is political. And especially when you're talking about a love affair involving a royal, this is always going to have political implications. So kings and queens, and even to some degree their families, they are never private citizens. And really you could even say there's no such thing as privacy when it comes to royals, because they are embodiments of the state, and even their actual physical bodies represent the state in a literal way. And this is part of, I think, of what Louis XIV was getting at when he famously said, "L'État, c'est moi, I am the state." And moreover, there's this long-standing belief that the king's body, his health, and his sexuality are all directly connected to the health and vitality of the realm. Those two things are inseparable. And there are all sorts of stories, such as the story of the Fisher King, which appears also in the Arthur mythos in the story of the quest for the Holy Grail. This is a king of a river realm, but this is a king who's been wounded on his thigh and is not healing, and hence the country also is sick and poor and unproductive, and only when he is healed is the country healed. So this sort of story is woven all through, especially British folklore and mythology. It's alluded to again, I think, in a way that might have been conscious or might have been unconscious, but it is clearly alluded to in Red, White, and Royal Blue when Henry describes himself as, quote, as gay as a maypole. So this line sets up a little joke because Alex doesn't know what that means, and a lot of viewers apparently didn't either. And if you don't know, the maypole is erected as part of the traditional celebration of May Day, the mid-spring festival. So it is very consciously a phallic symbol. It represents virility, reproduction, and moreover, the May Day celebrations connect the ideas of reproduction, renewal, spring, sexuality directly with royalty and kingship. And it is customary also on May Day for a town or a parish to elect a May king and queen, who are understood to be sort of the most attractive, sexually appealing, sexually potent young man and woman in the village. At points in British history, May Day and the May celebrations have been directly connected to the actual monarch. For instance, in the mid-1600s, when the British monarchy was briefly abolished, it was then brought back in 1660, and the Parliament actually proclaimed King Charles II restored and the monarchy restored on May Day, and the restoration then was celebrated with gigantic maypoles, including the largest one that had ever been seen in the middle of the Strand in London. So Henry is making an interesting sort of paradoxical allusion here when he says he's gay as a maypole, right? He's evoking this connection of royalty to fertility, to spring, to May. But ironically, he is gay. And in this way, in the traditional view, he then is sterile, right? He is unable to procreate and produce heirs in the way that is expected of a monarch or a future monarch. It underscores again this sense that the king's health, including his sexual health, is a public concern, a concern of the whole society. And this was even summed up formally in a political doctrine called the doctrine of the king's two bodies, which scholars have written about. So this is the idea that the king is sort of two persons in one. On the one hand, he has an ordinary physical human body that has health and sickness and that lives and dies like any other person. But at the same time, he has a second body, a sort of transcendent mystical body that represents the life of the state and that lives on and transfers from him to his successor and continues to live for as long as the state lives. And this idea then, I think, is even further invoked in Red, White, and Royal Blue when Henry, as we know, is living this double life and has a double identity. And he explicitly says, Prince Henry belongs to Britain. Henry Fox must belong to himself. So he's sort of a public property and a private individual at the same time, and these two things are in tension. And the further implication you could say here in this line is that, while Henry Fox may be gay, Prince Henry is not. So for all of these reasons, royal bodies are not really private. They're sort of public properties, and hence there's a lot politically at stake in what happens and what is done with the bodies of monarchs and their offspring, princes and princesses. And hence, in times of political crisis, of civil war or coups, or for any number of reasons, royals can in fact be locked up and imprisoned. The line that is the subtitle of this video comes from the piano scene in Kensington Palace, where Henry says he's had no communication with the king probably wants to forget he exists. Alex says, well, they can't keep you locked up here forever. And Henry sarcastically responds, we really need to get you a book on English history. So there are all kinds of incidents he may be thinking of here, and some of them fans have pointed out. For instance, Eleanor of Aquitaine, the very powerful wife of King Henry II, who basically cemented the English crown's control over most of France in the 1100s. She had a very powerful alliance with Henry, but then they fell out over the question of which of their sons should be Henry's successor. And she actually at one point made allies, raised an army, waged war against Henry, and was defeated. And she was locked up in a series of castles in England and France for the rest of her life. Henry couldn't really divorce her, so he had to just sort of lock her away. And this actually, it happens, was the basis for the play and movie The Lion in Winter. And in the movie, Eleanor is played by Katharine Hepburn and Henry by Peter O'Toole, and they have, wonderful fight scenes. And there's one point where she's allowed out of her prison to attend a Christmas court, but Henry warns, "I'll never let you out. You've led too many civil wars against me." And Eleanor retorts, "I nearly won the last one."
I'll never let you loose. You led too many civil wars against me.
And I damn near won the last one.
So Henry's sort of temporary imprisonment in Kensington Palace at the end of the movie echoes the imprisonment of Eleanor of Aquitaine. You also can think of King Richard II, who also provoked a civil war with his political enemies, and in his last days was locked up in Pontefract Castle and died under mysterious circumstances, probably murder. There's the more famous case of the princes in the Tower, the two young sons of King Edward IV, and the elder of which technically was proclaimed king and should have been King Edward V, but the two of them were locked up in the Tower of London and also disappeared, most likely were done away with by Richard III or maybe somebody else, but the sort of cloud of suspicion then hung over the rest of Richard III's reign. And as you may know, Shakespeare wrote a play on Richard III in which he clearly implied that Richard had ordered their murder. And then from the 1500s, there are the cases, of course, of Anne Boleyn, who was imprisoned on all kinds of trumped-up charges and then executed. The real reason why she was done away with was because she'd failed to have a male son, right? So again, her sexuality, her fertility was a matter of state and led to her being imprisoned and killed. Similarly, a later wife, Catherine Howard, was imprisoned in the Tower and executed. And then Anne Boleyn's own daughter, the Princess Elizabeth, she was imprisoned in the Tower as well during the reign of Queen Mary Tudor. So Mary was the eldest child of Henry and his first wife. When she came to the throne, she was a Catholic. She reinstituted Catholicism as the state religion. And her own sister, the Princess Elizabeth, was then suspect because she was known to have Protestant loyalties. And then ironically, after Elizabeth becomes queen, she then imprisons her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was, again, a relative, a possible claimant to the throne, and a Roman Catholic. And so she was a threat from the other direction, and ultimately was imprisoned and then executed. And some of you may also know in later years, in the 1800s, King George III was imprisoned in the last years of his life, and his son had to act as Prince Regent while he was locked up because he was suffering from severe dementia. So even though he was the king on the throne, the king regnant, unlike these other people we've been talking about who were princes or princesses or spouses of the king, he was the king, but the parliament, the rest of the court, the army saw him as unfit to rule because of his health and also as an embarrassment. Mental illness was very shameful at that time, so he was locked away. And if you've watched Bridgerton, you may remember, in my opinion, the best scene of the series is when we see Queen Charlotte go and visit King George III in his confinement, and it's, I think, a great depiction of dealing with a loved one with dementia. So those are just some examples just from Great Britain, right? The same sort of thing happens many times over in countries all around the world. And, unlike a normal politician or an army commander, the person and body of the monarch is politically loaded and hence has to be in some way controlled and does not really belong to himself or herself as a person. And when it comes to princes, while they themselves are not monarchs, nonetheless, they are monarchs in waiting. They represent the future of the monarchy, And more specifically, the continuation of the state depends on their sexuality, their ability to procreate. And hence, Henry is not unique or new in being a prince who attracts attention and controversy to his sexuality and his sex life. There was, for instance, Prince Albert Victor, who was the eldest son of Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert, and who was admired, charismatic, but also was surrounded by rumors about his sex life. He supposedly patronized prostitutes, female and possibly male. He was rumored to have venereal diseases. He died at the age of only 28, and so never became king. And it was widely rumored that his death was the result of syphilis, and that may or may not be true, right? This was kind of a state secret, but there is documentation showing that he suffered from gonorrhea. And you might think also of the recent furor over the health and whereabouts of Kate Middleton, also known as the Princess of Wales, who was suffering from her own health problems, needed treatment. But it became this massive international public issue and a furor because there was so little information and explanation about what was going on and whether it was going to be resolved. And that can be taken as just another illustration that even royals who are not on the throne are kind of public properties, and their bodies are matters of state. They are not simply private matters. And as long as there's a royal family, they will never really have complete privacy. And just something to note further about Prince Henry, he is very much subject to this kind of scrutiny and control. At the same time, he's kind of peripheral. He is not the Prince of Wales. Right? So this term is used in reference to Henry in the book. It didn't make it over into the movie, probably partly because it's not strictly accurate. So at any given moment, only one person can have that title of Prince of Wales, and that is the eldest son and heir apparent of the current reigning monarch. And if the current reigning monarch doesn't have an eldest son, then there is no Prince of Wales. Simple as that. So Henry, as a grandson of the king and as the younger son of the king's daughter, Princess Catherine, he would definitely not be called Prince of Wales. He would not have that title. And as he says, he's not even really the direct lineal heir of his mother. He's just the spare. Technically, I'm the spare, he says. But nonetheless, spares do matter, right? They are backup. If they can provide more children and hence more successors, that wards off the danger of the current royal line dying out and then the palace having to reach into some far distant branch of the family and pull in someone who hasn't perhaps been groomed and trained for this position, who might break the rules and who might just upset the apple cart, right? So Henry still matters, and especially his body, his ability to reproduce matters to the palace and to the stability of the whole state system. And he really acknowledges this again openly when he says Prince Henry belongs to Britain. Now, as for marriage more specifically, this is where all of this really came into play, right? And probably a lot of you know that historically marriage among royals has been an affair of state. And the common accepted norm from the Middle Ages right through the 18th century was that royal marriages were diplomatic, and they would be negotiated and they would be used as instruments to manage alliances and relationships among different states. So it was never really a private matter. And of course, the question would arise then, well, what if a royal match is made and the two are not in love and they're not really companions to one another? Well, there were all kinds of solutions to this, and really for centuries, adultery was accepted, especially for male royals, more so than female royals, although, queens could find ways to have fun on the side as well. But for male royals, adultery was really accepted and tolerated. It was basically an open secret, as long as it was maintained within certain accepted channels. So if the king had mistresses, that was widely known. In some cases, like Louis XV in France, it was basically an official position to be the king's mistress. It was part of life at court. And some kings, going all the way back to Charlemagne in the Frankish Empire, had multiple mistresses to the point of almost like a harem of concubines. Another instance of this was Charles II, that same king who was brought back in the Restoration that I mentioned before, who was seen to represent vitality, virility. He had probably a dozen or more mistresses, many of which were pretty much openly, publicly known. This could be maintained as an accepted open secret as long as you avoided mistresses who would have too much political influence and who could try to steer policy or patronage, and as long as their religion was not an issue. And that did become a problem for Charles II because he clearly had some sort of leanings and sympathies towards Catholicism. His brother converted to Catholicism, and some of his mistresses were Catholic. And when there were anti-Catholic fears and riots in the 1680s, sometimes mobs attacked people they saw as kind of enemies of Protestantism. And at one point, a mob surrounded and threatened Nell Gwynn, an actress who was one of Charles II's mistresses. And she reached out and reportedly calmed the crowd by saying, "Be calm, good people, I am the Protestant whore." So that shows you, the degree to which it was really a known fact at many points in history. But it was accepted as long as it avoided those pitfalls of political and religious conflict. And by 1700, it was understood the real danger when it came to the monarchical succession, in Britain at least, was the danger of a Catholic coming to the throne and changing the country's religious policy, right? That's what these wars largely had been fought over in the 1600s, and there was a determination among most of the British elites that the throne had to stay in Protestant hands. That's a large part of why there was the so-called Glorious Revolution in 1688, when James II was overthrown, replaced by his Protestant daughter. And after his daughters, the last of his daughters was Queen Anne, who's depicted in the movie The Favourite. After she died, they then reached to a distant German branch of relatives and brought them to the throne because they were Protestants, and they were the Hanovers. And through the 1700s, there was a power struggle then between these two dynastic lines, the Stuarts and the Hanovers. And the Parliament passed a series of acts of succession and then acts governing royal marriage. So they first stipulated that no monarch can be a Catholic and no one married to a Catholic can come to the British throne. And then also that because this was such a fraught political issue and they didn't want it to erupt in another conflict if a Catholic or the spouse of a Catholic came to the throne, they passed laws in the later 1700s giving the monarch, as head of the royal family, the power to veto any marriage that they disapproved of anyone in the family. And if a royal, say, eloped and married some, foreign dignitary or some commoner that the monarch disapproved of, they could just nullify the marriage so that in British law it was over. And those laws are still in force. So that is still the case today, that if you are in the royal family or the line of succession, your marriage must be approved by the monarch, and they can not only block it, but even nullify it after the fact. Now, you may have noticed, as I said, the power struggle in the 1700s was mainly between supporters of the Stuarts, who at that point were Catholic, and the Hanovers, who were the Protestant replacements brought in as against the Stuarts. And so it's very ironic that in Red, White, and Royal Blue, we're told that the royal house, their name is Hanover Stuart. So they've taken these two enemy dynasties and linked them together with a hyphen. And maybe that's sort of a cute little inside joke. Maybe it's a suggestion that we're looking at a sort of alternate timeline where somehow the Hanovers and the Stuarts reconciled, and it's their joint successors now who we're seeing ruling Great Britain, and that's where Henry comes from. That much is not explained, and probably not. Now, it happens that the last male Hanover rulers were King George IV and King William IV, both of whom were sons of George III. And after both of them had died, it then passed to their niece, the young Princess Victoria, who came to the throne in 1837 at the age of only 18, and then ruled for 64 years through all the rest of the 19th century. And she was the longest reigning British monarch up until Elizabeth II in recent times. And Victoria really changed the sort of symbolism and public role of the monarchy. She was cast as a kind of national mother, symbolizing domesticity and propriety. And it happens that she herself and her personality was very moralistic and puritanical. And she set about trying to clean up the court after the reigns of what she called her wicked uncles, George and William. And her sort of personal prudishness also carried over into the public and political sphere. And it was in her reign, the so-called Victorian era, that Britain enacted its first laws against obscenity and prostitution, which previously had been legal. And she completely rejected this traditional idea about mistresses and royal adultery. And for this reason, she really despised and looked down upon her own son, Albert Edward, who ultimately became her successor, and condemned him as totally unfit to rule because he was known to have multiple mistresses. He had kind of a mistress in every port. So Victoria was prudish. She began to crack down on the sort of personal conduct of the royal family because she saw them as moral exemplars for proper family and marriage life. And it happens that she herself also had a very close and loving, even passionate marriage with her husband, the German Prince Albert. And this relationship sort of became the model for proper royal marriage. And it is alluded to in the movie, again, when Alex and Henry go at night to the Victoria and Albert Museum, right, which was begun as a sort of monument to their marriage. Victoria also went into deep mourning after Albert's death. So after he died at a fairly young age, in his 40s, she then wore black and remained in mourning and did very few public occasions for all the rest of her life, for 40 more years. And so she cultivated this image as dour and reclusive, as well as completely devoted to her sort of domestic personal relationships, her private realm in the palace. She was sometimes called the Widow of Windsor, right? Because she would be sort of ensconced in Windsor Castle for months at a time. And Victoria casts a very long shadow over the British monarchy right up to today. Again, she recast the royal family as symbols of morality, propriety, and proper family life. And she set the image of the royals as serious, stoic, and dutiful. And hence the irony then of the line in Henry and Alex's interview when they're talking about the cake incident, and Henry claims there are food fights all the time. They happened all the time in the reign of Victoria. Right? So that is an inside joke that probably a lot of Britons will get, because Victoria is the very opposite of the fun-loving, hedonistic monarch, which she specifically wanted to reject. Now, in the 20th century, the royal family's role continued to evolve and arguably expand, and the pressure upon them to serve as sort of perfect national symbols only increased. For example, in the two world wars, people looked to the royal family as patriotic symbols of the nation. They had to be, again, stoic and dutiful and dissociate themselves from foreign connections or influence. And that's why during the First World War, when Britain was at war with Germany, they adopted this new dynastic name of Windsor to make themselves seem more English and to distance themselves from their German roots, right? Prince Albert had been German, the Hanovers were originally German. So they have to serve as sort of perfect national symbols, and hence they have to be strictly non-partisan. And the political role of the monarchy changed. So whereas earlier monarchs could exert a lot of influence behind the scenes and have clear political leanings and preferences, everyone knew Victoria preferred the conservatives over the liberals in her time. Well, now they had to be strictly nonpartisan and appear above the fray. They represent all of Britain, all parties, and keep their personal views very much under wraps. Even arguably in their interactions with the government and with ministers, they had to appear as sort of perfectly impartial. And this meant that royal marriages also changed. So where they previously had been diplomatic and hence sort of openly political, now they had to become patriotic. They had to marry someone from within the country and, again, present this sort of perfect face of a perfect family. And part of why this change happened also was because of democratization and revolutions in the European continent. So you had royal families being overthrown or removed from power in Russia, Germany, Italy, Austria. You were running out of potential diplomatic marriage partners. So diplomatic marriage was less politically useful. As the royal families in Europe dwindled, the danger of inbreeding became only greater. And, inbreeding is a perennial problem with royals when you're marrying within a tiny, rarefied circle. That's also alluded to in the movie when Alex says, you have so many moles, is that a result of inbreeding? And after 1920, that old system was really impossible. So the new model was to marry a subject, again from one's own country, preferably someone of high social status and a virgin, so as to maintain this image of sexual purity as well as class and national purity. And marrying simply for love alone was unacceptable. And so the model then became find some nice, socially respectable, high-status person from within Britain and marry them. And arguably an early example of that was George V and his marriage to Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who was a sort of low-level minor noble from Scotland. And they then became the king and queen during the Second World War, right? And became these models of British unity and patriotism, and the parents, of course, of Elizabeth II. And furthermore, with this new casting of the royal family as moral exemplars, mistresses and adultery also became more and more unacceptable. You really had to be monogamous, and affairs were more likely to be exposed and criticized. It leads to an extremely narrow range of choice for monarchs or potential future monarchs. You have to find exactly the right person from a sort of limited social pool, and they have to be basically your companion. You're not supposed to step out and go off with anyone else, someone you actually like or are in love with. And what happens when the political demands of royal marriage and personal feelings don't align? Well, that could be a problem, and there are several possible solutions. One of them is simply abdication. And this is what happened in 1936, when Edward, who had previously been Prince of Wales, comes to the throne as Edward VIII. And already by the time he's proclaimed king, he is in love with an American, twice divorced socialite named Wallis Simpson. And firstly, the Anglican Church and then the powers that be in Parliament make clear that this is a totally unacceptable idea. The king cannot marry an American divorcee and one who is reputed to have an extensive sexual history. This is totally out of the question. And moreover, even if he does go through and do it and marry this woman, which he legally can, she will not be accepted or recognized with the title of queen, and their children will not be accepted as successors to the throne. And that is the breaking point for Edward. He sees that as totally unacceptable. He cares about Wallis, and this is a slap in the face to her. So he decides to abdicate. Before he even has a coronation, he abdicates, and that is why the throne goes then to his brother, and that is why we have the royal line on the throne now. So the abdication crisis was a serious problem for the monarchy, but it's very ambiguous because the public, it seems, basically accepted it. The public basically said, well, that's his choice. If he wants to be with this woman, fine. They can go off and be in love. They get the title of Duke and Duchess of Windsor. And people are perfectly happy with having George on the throne, and he's a popular king. So it all works out fine for the public. But evidently, for the royal family, this was seen as catastrophic. This was seen as undermining the authority of the monarchy. It is seen as a betrayal, right? A betrayal of the sense of duty and propriety. It's a slap in the face to everything that Victoria stood for. And in their view, it unfairly thrusts the responsibilities of rule onto George, the younger brother, who had been the spare, right? So this is an instance where the spare does become king. It thrusts those responsibilities onto him. He's very uncomfortable. He feels he doesn't have the charisma of his elder brother. He has a stutter that's depicted in the king's speech. And then he has poor health. And when he dies, it passes to his 25-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, who feels that she is thrust into the role too soon and is not ready for it that early in her life. So the lesson that the royal family takes from it seems to be that personal feelings and preferences must be suppressed and subordinated for the good of the monarchy and the state. And again, this only compounds this sort of looming legacy of Victoria and this very repressive sense of what a monarch is supposed to be. And there's one particular incident that I think is especially revealing and especially relevant to Red, White, and Royal Blue, and that is the case of Prince William of Gloucester. So this was a royal prince who was the first cousin of Queen Elizabeth. He was born in the 40s during the war, and for a time in his youth, he was the fourth in line to the throne. So he was a very significant royal prince. But he ended up being sort of overshadowed because Queen Elizabeth, as we know, had children, and so she had a line of succession. But William was still in the picture, and it happened that he was very talented and charismatic. He loved to travel. He loved to fly. He was an amateur pilot, and he was exceptionally handsome and good-looking, especially for, a British royal. As it happens, when he was on a sort of diplomatic mission to Japan, he attended a masquerade party hosted by a Hungarian-born socialite and model named Zsuzsi Starkloff. And Zsuzsi was an interesting figure. She was a central person in the social world of Tokyo, Japan. Although she had been born and raised in Hungary, she was a former flight attendant and was working as a model. And apparently she and William hit it off very quickly. Their personalities were compatible. They had shared interest in flying. And they had a long-lasting love affair. They together bought a house in the countryside in Japan, spent summers there. This was widely known that this love affair was going on. But she was very much not acceptable as a marriage partner. She was a number of years older. She was about 8 or 9 years older than William. She was divorced. She was a divorced mom, she was a foreigner, and she was Catholic. And all of these things made her absolutely beyond the pale. Now, nonetheless, it seems that the Queen and Princess Margaret sort of felt her out, at least momentarily, even though it was clear that this was very much against the rules and interests of the royal family. And William had to sort of weigh and balance how much he wanted to be alienated from the royal family if he went ahead with this marriage. And it seems that in the late 60s, he temporarily broke off the affair with Zsuzsi Starkloff. And then a couple of years later, he tragically died in a flight accident in an airplane race in England. And he was only 30. And the story of his affair with Zsuzsi was very private, and the details were quite secret until pretty recently, until the 2010s, when Zsuzsi herself was older and dealing with cancer, and she began to open up and talk about her affair with Prince William back in the 60s. And it was actually reported, I believe in 2012, that she told a journalist that before William died, he gave to her his gold signet ring with his royal insignia, which she then wore on a chain around her neck for the rest of her life. We don't know for certain, but I would venture to say probably Casey McQuiston saw some of these reports in the 2010s, and that played into the affair of Alex and Henry. Now, lastly, another tragic royal marriage that clearly is invoked and alluded to in Red, White, and Royal Blue is the ill-fated marriage of Charles and Diana. And it casts a certain light on the movie, especially when we hear these small tidbits about Henry's life. The fact that his father has died several years earlier, and also, as he says in the hospital scene when they're stuck in the closet, he says that he had been, quote, paraded around to the public even when he was still in mourning for his father. And you can see there a clear resonance with Princes William and Harry having to march in the funeral ceremony in London after the death of their mother, when they were still clearly grieving. And arguably, they show, even still today, unresolved grief from the death of their mother, as Henry does for his father. So there are many obvious references here you can see to Prince William and Prince Harry. However, he's not clearly identified with either one of them. So in some ways, you can see Henry as a great deal like William, being very clean-cut, dutiful, well-behaved, discreet. Also, on the other hand, of course, there are the many connections to Harry. He's the younger brother. Prince Harry's actual given name is Henry. And a lot like Harry, he can be overshadowed by his elder brother, but he is popular, well-liked. He's a bit of a rebel. He's had scandals in his private life. And Harry, of course, ultimately ends up marrying a biracial American. So there are many of these sort of connections and points of contact that you can see between the current princes and Henry in the movie. In some ways, you could see Henry as being sort of the both of them combined. He's maybe William on the outside and more like Harry in private. But really, I would say these parallels are mostly fairly superficial or circumstantial. And more fundamentally, in terms of his character, really, I believe Henry is patterned much more so and inspired much more by Diana herself. And there are many connections that you can see around Henry that connect him to Diana. Just beginning on the superficial level, the blonde hair, the fact that he lives in Kensington Palace. That is where Diana lived during the last years of her life, and it's always associated with her because it was the site of those spontaneous memorials, the outpourings of offerings of flowers and art that were laid out in front of the Kensington Palace gates. Diana was known for visiting patients in hospitals. That became almost kind of her trademark, again, in the later years of her life. That's what we see Henry doing in the movie, visiting patients and getting close and even touching hospital patients. He is known as charismatic, good-looking, charming. He has good taste. He's fashionable. But he also is seen as personable and compassionate, and he's referred to right at the start of the movie as the Prince of England's Hearts, which is a pretty clear reference to Diana, who is called the Princess or Queen of Hearts, and who explicitly, in her sort of explosive Martin Bashir interview when she was in process of divorce, she said she didn't expect she would ever be queen of the country, again, as Henry doesn't think he's going to be king, but she wants to be known as the Queen of People's Hearts. So there are these clear allusions bringing Diana to mind. And then more fundamentally, there is the split personality, right? So with Henry, there is this divide between his external and internal selves, or between, you could say, his public and private selves, which he is able to manage, this sort of balancing act between his perfect public image and his very tormented private life. He's able to maintain this balance because he's a great performer. He can hide his inner turmoil and unhappiness and appear carefree, comfortable in his constant public appearances. And Diana herself was also masterful at this, and it's interesting that she excelled in theater in her early life, in her education. And she was always a consummate performer. And the extent of the chaos and conflict in her private life, it was never known until it was revealed as the marriage broke up. And you could say that Diana sort of managed this transition, this exposure of her private life, her private unhappiness, through these grand events like the Martin Bashir interview. But we actually know today, because of the release of more information, more records, we know that she really wasn't so in control, and that famous interview with Martin Bashir, she was actually tricked into. And Bashir and his conspirators, his co-conspirators, actually created false documents to give Diana the impression that she was being spied on by agents of the intelligence services in her own inner circle, and hence she had to put out her side of the story first before she was exposed against her will. So she really was being manipulated, and her privacy was constantly being violated through force or deception. And in this way, you can see her as a precedent and a parallel to what happens to Henry, right? When his emails are hacked and his private affair is exposed. And also this is a point of similarity as well with Prince Harry. So Harry also has literally been hacked, specifically through his phone. And it seems now there's a great deal of proof that this was a very common practice in the British tabloid press, to hack into famous people's phones, listen to their messages, and then expose their private dealings. And it seems this happened to Harry, and he recently sued in British court, complaining that his private affairs had been exposed by this hacking, and the court ruled in his favor in really a remarkable precedent-setting decision that I think has not been fully reported and explored for its significance, not just as part of royal history and the management of the royal public image, but really of the relationship between the press and the public, that certain press outlets in Britain are actually being held accountable for violations of privacy. And lastly, this underscores something that Prince Harry has been saying for a number of years, and that he spoke about, for example, in his memoir, which also is really remarkable as a bestseller, a global bestseller of a royal memoir. That is the power of the British press, and especially of this sort of lowbrow, quasi-tabloid British press of outlets like The Sun and The Mirror, which are sometimes in British English are called the red tops, which have a great deal of the power of television in the United States, but I would argue are really even more pervasive and who actually have tremendous power to shape people's perception and feelings about public people and public institutions. Harry has argued that there's a sort of incestuous codependency of the royal family and the tabloid press. The royals depend on the press to depict them in a positive way, to cultivate public favor, and in exchange they often feed negative stories or information about other people, including other royals, to kind of feed this constant gossip mill and sort of public frenzy of fascination and outrage. And Harry has described certain things that have not been externally corroborated, may or may not be true, but he's described press, writers, columnists, editors actually holding their own holiday parties in the palace to show how sort of close and incestuous this connection is. And also he's described the royals actually going to breakfast and having the tabloids laid out on the table in front of them. And he uses this to sort of illustrate how much even the royals themselves and their self-image and self-understanding can be shaped by the press. And this is, I think, echoed and maybe intentionally alluded to then in the scene when Prince Henry has been hacked. He wakes up in his bedroom not knowing what's happened. He goes out into the sitting room and there are the tabloids, the red tops, laid out on the coffee table. So I think that this movie in this way is very conscious of the place of the royal family and the juncture that it faces now in history. All of these allusions and parallels say certain things about Alex and Henry's relationship. This relationship clearly would be taboo. And the obvious reason is because it's same-sex, and there hasn't been an openly gay royal in modern times. I'll talk later about other gay royals. But before we get into that, the clear surface reason why this would be a taboo relationship and politically explosive is because it's a gay relationship. But on top of that, also, Alex is foreign. He's biracial. He has both of these things in common with Meghan Markle, whose relationship with Prince Harry was ultimately, I would say, hounded out of British life. But even more than that, Alex also is an active partisan political operative. He's aligned with a foreign politician, his mother being the President of the United States. This, more than anything, would really make their relationship impossible. Part of why it's impossible is because it would violate this accepted precedent now that the royal family is nonpartisan and stays above the fray of politics. And that's why royals cannot date politicians. That is not accepted. And also, even if it was allowed to go on in some way, even if some accommodation was made, it would be perfect fodder for constant tabloid rumor, gossip, attack. They would be the greatest targets that these tabloids could possibly hope for. And it would be nonstop. It would be probably like Harry and Meghan's relationship, but even worse and even more constitutionally and politically problematic. But all of that being said, nonetheless, the fact that this is a same-sex relationship in Red, White, and Royal Blue is very important and significant, and it relates to the symbolism of the story, the symbolism of the relationship between monarchy and democracy and between Britain and America. The fact that these are both men, right? And the queer dimension of this story is central, right? I don't mean to say it's unimportant. And many of you may be asking by this point, what about the allusions that have been pointed out to previous gay or queer royals? And that is another history we can get into now. So perhaps not surprisingly, there have been gay, lesbian, queer monarchs and royals of various descriptions all around the world through the years, and more specifically within Europe. The custom when it came to homosexuality among royals was basically similar to the rules around adultery. It could basically be tolerated and even be an open secret within certain bounds, as long as it was kept at least somewhat discreet, as long as some plausible deniability was maintained, and as long as the monarch's lovers were kept strictly apart from politics, and the relationships were not seen as having any effect on royal policy or patronage. One example you could see of a ruler who effectively struck this balance was King Frederick II, also called Frederick the Great of Prussia in the 1700s, who was married, but who reportedly just ignored his wife, didn't have any children, and who spent most of his private time with male favorites, and actually built the Baroque palace at Sanssouci basically as a country retreat in which he could surround himself with a circle of men. A more problematic case was Queen Christina of Sweden in the 1600s, who actually refused to marry at all, and often dressed in male clothes and in other ways violated gender norms for a woman, and who ultimately abdicated from the throne, converted to Catholicism, and moved to Rome, where she took up residence in a villa in the outskirts of the city, and lived openly with her female companion, whom she referred to as her bedfellow. Christina, while she was able to basically, get away with being about as openly lesbian as one could be, the difference in her career as opposed to Frederick's shows that the situation was more difficult for women, with the emphasis on marriage and childbearing, and also that the situation for a gay ruler could be managed if one at least went through the motions of heterosexual marriage. Now, as for how this all played out within Britain, well, in English history, there are two prominent cases of gay or queer monarchs where their sexuality played a really significant role in the politics of their reigns. And those are Edward II, who ruled in the early 1300s, and James I in the early 1600s. And these are actually alluded to in red, white, and royal blue when one looks at Prince Henry's full name. So we see him tell Alex that his full name, all included, is Henry George Edward James Hanover Stuart Fox. And so it has those names Edward and James in there, and it's actually said explicitly in the book. The Prince Henry in the book says to Alex, quote, "I got both of the gay kings." So he sees these names as somehow prophetic of his own identity as a gay prince. That carries a lot of baggage if we consider who these men were and what happened to them in their times on the throne. So Edward II ruled from 1307 to 1327, and his reign was mostly catastrophic, and this was partly connected to his sexuality. The main problem of his reign was the ongoing wars in Scotland, in which Edward struggled with Robert the Bruce for control of the Scottish throne. And these wars went on intermittently for decades, and in Edward's reign they were mostly unsuccessful and they were very costly. So Edward levied heavy taxes and requisitioned money and supplies from the large landowners of England, who informally are called the barons. And this led then to a series of rebellions by the barons against the crown, in which they formed coalitions to oppose and constrain the powers of the king, especially with regard to taxes. But a factor was also scandals over Edward's so-called favorites, the first and most important of which was Piers Gaveston. So Piers was Edward's longtime companion since his youth. He was 2 years older than Edward, and he came from a comparatively modest background, not a noble family, but he was a good fighter and came to prominence that way. And Edward's father, King Edward I, had actually assigned Piers Gaveston as a retainer and guide for the young prince when he was a teenager. But the relationship, it seems, became too close. And so the king eventually banished Piers Gaveston from England. But in 1307, when Edward became king himself as Edward II, he immediately brought Piers Gaveston back, and furthermore lavished him with titles and important offices, such as Lord of Man and very significantly Earl of Cornwall, which was a title that was usually reserved only for a member of the royal family. And Edward himself actually married a French princess named Isabella, But it seems as if his relationship with Piers Gaveston sometimes sort of competed or even took precedence over his marriage. For instance, at the coronation in which King Edward and his wife were formally crowned, Piers Gaveston carried the crown jewels and wore robes in royal purple, and then held the celebratory banquet after the ceremony in which Gaveston hung up banners with Gaveston's and the king's arms combined together in the manner that one would ordinarily only do with a married couple. So it's almost as if he was signaling that he was the king's real spouse. In 1310, a few years after he came to the throne, the barons rebelled and overcame the king's forces, and one of their demands was that Piers Gaveston be banished from England. And he was sent away to Ireland, where King Edward then appointed him as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. So he still was giving him these powerful roles and titles. Eventually, Piers was allowed back into England, but then in 1312 the barons rebelled again and demanded that Piers be exiled from all of Edward's realms, including England and Ireland. And when Gaveston stayed nonetheless and tried to fight alongside the king, eventually a renegade baronial family captured and hanged Piers Gaveston. So the king, after this, did at first make a temporary peace with the barons, but then he formed an alliance with another important noble family, the Despensers. And the crown and the Spencers went on a punitive campaign, seizing money and lands from the various barons who had rebelled against him and splitting the spoils. And the king, it seems at this time, took another lover, or so-called favorite. This was Hugh Despenser, to whom he gave similar titles and offices to what he had lavished upon Piers Gaveston. And Hugh Despenser became highly powerful and moreover was more brutal and ruthless than either Edward or Piers had been. And this is part of what established the Spencers as a sort of lasting, powerful dynasty within England. And it happens that Hugh Despenser was a direct ancestor of Lady Diana Spencer, who came, of course, to be known as Princess Diana. Just an odd aside. In 1321, the barons rebelled again against the tyrannies of Edward and Hugh Despenser, and furthermore, the disgruntled Queen Isabella brokered an alliance between the rebels and France. They were able to capture both Hugh and the king, both of whom were then condemned and executed, and Edward's young son took up the throne then and went on to rule as Edward III. Now, this fiasco with Edward II became notorious, right, and was remembered for many years in England. In 1592, Christopher Marlowe wrote a play about him, and like most of Marlowe's plays, it involves more or less open homoerotic themes. It presents Edward as a complex and ambiguous figure who was more naive and easily manipulated than a villain, and it leaves the judgment of his homosexuality unclear. You could sort of read it in different ways, as this was Edward's tragic flaw, or that it was the barons' fault for being prejudiced against his love for Piers Gaveston. The play also plays upon the theme of Gaveston's exile to Ireland and return, and it suggests a sort of parallel between Edward's affair with Piers Gaveston and the fraught, ambiguous relationship between England and Ireland. And you can see this as similar in this way to Red, White, and Royal Blue, which uses the fictitious affair between Henry and Alex as a sort of metaphor for the relationship between Britain and America. It happens that Marlowe's play was also made into a movie in 1991, and some scenes arguably are reminiscent of Red, White, and Royal Blue, such as one where we see the king and Piers Gaveston dancing in a dimly lit underground bunker. This sort of dim light and the color palette, the mood, I think in many ways is evoked in Red, White, and Royal Blue in the museum scene. So Edward II arguably showed the limits of this sort of open secret policy about homosexuality. And Edward may not have been unique or maybe even unusual in having male lovers in his circle, but he was too open about it. It became too apparent to Edward's subjects. And for instance, the Bishop of Winchester reportedly gave a sermon in 1326 in which he openly called the king a sodomite. And even more importantly, Edward crossed the line in giving too much political power and patronage to his lovers. And this really was a big problem with male homosexuality in the royal family, in that female mistresses could arguably exercise some influence behind the scenes, but they couldn't have formal offices and authority. There was sort of nothing there to object to. Whereas with male lovers, the temptation was always there, at least for the lovers themselves, to use their personal access to the monarch to gain formal offices and titles. And this made the relationship in a way too visible and gave it too many political implications. And you can see this situation come into play again 300 years later with King James I. So he actually first became King of Scotland when he was a child, after the death of his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, in 1567. And then he became King of England as well in 1603 and ruled for 22 years. And he also was known to have attractive young male companions with whom he spent a great deal of his time, to whom he wrote love letters, some of which survive. And he had an especially passionate affair with George Villiers, a young athlete and courtier. And this caused some degree of scandal when the king gave George the title of Duke of Buckingham, another very prestigious title that previously had been mainly for royals. And he found that he had to kind of answer for this and try to quell the controversy around his relationship with George. And in 1617, he said to the Privy Council, quote, "You may be sure that I love the Earl of Buckingham more than anyone else, and more than you who are here assembled. I wish to speak in my own behalf, and not to have it thought to be a defect. For Jesus Christ did the same, and therefore I cannot be blamed. Christ had John, and I have George." End quote. So you can see he's sort of deflecting suspicion by making this religious reference. And by all evidence, he was a religious man. And in this way, kind of daring people to still claim that there was some sexual or improper element to his relationship with George, because by implication, you'd be saying that Jesus Christ had done the same thing. And this sort of stir around James's relationship with George Villiers actually is also mentioned explicitly in the book of Red, White, and Royal Blue. Henry brings it up. And also, incidentally, this affair is the subject of a recent TV series called Mary and George, in which Nicholas Galitzine, the actor who plays Henry, plays George Villiers, which may or may not just be a coincidence. But nonetheless, regardless of all that, King James was able to handle the controversy over his love life better than Edward II did. And this is probably mainly just because he was a more shrewd and successful ruler than Edward. He pursued peace with rivals such as Spain, and he undertook successful projects such as early colonization in America. Jamestown is named after him, and religious endeavors like a literary translation of the Bible into English, what we now know as the King James Bible. And furthermore, it seems that he knew better how to exercise discretion and how to push boundaries without crossing them. For example, in the 2000s, during a renovation of the royal residence at Apethorpe Hall, it was found that a passageway, a secret hidden passageway, had been installed connecting King James's bedroom with George's. So you have to find your ways to have fun and not get in trouble for it. Now, there are some other incidents that in some ways can be seen as similar, but were not as impactful. In the early 1700s, Queen Anne had very close female favorites, including the Duchess of Marlborough. She was rumored to have a sexual relationship with one or more of them. And this might have just been ignored as insignificant, but it did become a bit of a scandal because of the enormous political power that the Duchess of Marlborough exercised, for a time acting as basically de facto prime minister. And this is a large part of why eventually the Duchess was dismissed from court in 1710, and reportedly the Queen never met with her again. There was the incident of Prince Albert Victor, which I mentioned earlier, who was rumored to patronize a male brothel at Cleveland Street. And this was really politically insignificant. Nobody thought that these, male prostitutes were somehow pulling political strings. But it was a bit scandalous because by that time, in the late 19th century, homosexuality was so deeply taboo and reviled. It was often an object of criminal prosecution, such as happened with Oscar Wilde and also happened with other patrons of the Cleveland Street brothel. But ultimately, these stories just faded out after the prince's death and had no real political ramifications. Now, the last instance I'll mention is possibly the closest and most significant analog and precedent for our Prince Henry, and that is Prince Henry of Monmouth, an actual Prince of Wales who was named Henry. He was the son of King Henry IV and had the title of Prince of Wales in the early 1400s. And he reportedly led a rowdy and bawdy style of life in taverns and brothels around London before eventually becoming king and taking the throne as Henry V in 1413, and thereafter spending much of his reign fighting wars in France. Now, there is no strong evidence or contemporary evidence that he was gay. But, as it happens, in the 1500s, Shakespeare wrote a series of 3 plays, largely centering on him. So he's a figure that Shakespeare was really fascinated with. And the first 2 follow him when he was prince, and they show him living a dissolute life of robbery and skullduggery. And they portray him as having close male friendships with friends like the old knight John Falstaff and his younger friend Ned Poins. And these relationships have strong homoerotic undertones. And moreover, Shakespeare portrays Prince Henry as living a kind of double life, between the court on the one hand and the London underworld on the other, and as having a kind of split personality, being dutiful and dignified at certain moments, and then mischievous and rebellious at others. And when he becomes king, he dramatically transforms his character and persona and becomes a very dignified, reserved, and in a way enigmatic ruler. And when old friends like Falstaff approach him, he banishes them from his presence. And in a speech at the end of Henry IV, Part 2, he says to Falstaff, quote, "Presume not that I am the thing I was, for God doth know, so shall the world perceive, that I have turned away my former self. So will I those that kept me company." And I think you can see here in this scene something very reminiscent of Prince Henry withdrawing and his attempt to kind of banish Alex from his presence. And once again, you can see a reference to this character appearing in the book of Red, White, and Royal Blue, when we're told that Henry's parents, Princess Catherine and Arthur Fox, originally met when Arthur was playing Henry V on stage. So all of these precedents, I think, bring up certain questions, such as, firstly, what would happen to a gay prince like Henry? And that is a real unanswered question, because there has not been an openly gay royal in the modern era, certainly not since the gay rights movement. It happens that in Britain, gay marriage was legalized in 2014, and this reform required the royal assent. So Queen Elizabeth II had to approve of this change in British law. But there are conflicting accounts as to whether the Queen herself really supported it or not. And moreover, it's unclear and untested whether or not the royal family today would embrace a gay royal. In 2019, Prince William said that he would support his son or daughter if one of them came out as gay. But that hasn't happened, of course, and we still don't know what would actually happen in practice. And even aside from Prince William or King Charles, if he's still on the throne, what about the press? What about the public? All of this is a wild card. Now, one example that you might see royalists occasionally point to is King Charles's second cousin, named Lord Ivar Mountbatten, who is related to the king because his father was a first cousin of Prince Philip, King Charles's father. And Ivar Mountbatten got married to his male partner in 2018. So sometimes people will claim this means that the monarchy, the palace, accepts and approves of gay relationships and even gay marriage. However, Lord Ivar Mountbatten is not really a royal, strictly speaking. He is not an HRH. He does not have the title of His Royal Highness. He just happens to be distantly related to the king. And furthermore, when this wedding happened in 2018, there were no royals in attendance, and the royal family made no public comment about the marriage. So it's really still an unknown. How would they really respond to something like this in the royal family itself? Secondly, another question is, how does all of this history and precedent inform how we understand the monarch in the movie, which is the fictitious James III? And how do we understand his behavior, his goals, his motives? And this is important because Henry being accepted as a gay prince really depends largely on the king. And the king seems to invoke the sort of traditional standard, the unspoken rule, that gay relationships can go on as long as they are veiled behind some degree of secrecy or disavowal. And according to Henry, the king has said he doesn't want Henry's private life to, quote, reflect poorly on the crown. And when the affair with Alex is exposed, the king wants to deny it. But at the same time, he does not express any disgust about this relationship and does not evidently try to end it, right? He just wants to keep it secret and to disavow it publicly. Now, one might ask, why not? Why isn't the king shocked? Why doesn't he express disgust, disapproval? Why doesn't he try to break up this relationship? Well, there are a number of things to note that are suggestive about King James in the context of this history we've been talking about. For one thing, he has the first name James, and his last name contains the surname Stuart. And this recalls then James I, who was the first Stuart king of England, and who, as we said, had more or less openly known gay affairs. Furthermore, when it comes to our fictitious King James III, there is no mention at all of his spouse. What about his marriage or his love life? He must have had one, he has daughters. But we hear nothing, there's no mention, even when they are explicitly discussing love. Hence, one could suppose maybe he married for duty, and it was not a particularly close or loving marriage. Also, he is clearly very concerned from even before the beginning of the story. He's concerned with Henry and his sexuality. He apparently clocks Henry as gay, so to speak, from very early on, and he reportedly warns Henry about his desires when Henry is coming of age. And moreover, the particular type of warning that he gives is significant. He describes Henry's desires as selfish. And this is actually a change from the book. In the book, the fictitious queen reportedly warns Henry against his unnatural desires. Well, in the movie, they're called selfish. So there's this understanding here that Henry's desires may not be bad in themselves, but indulging in them is somehow against his duty to the country. Moreover, the king expresses no shock or surprise or disgust at Henry being gay or being in a same-sex relationship, and in fact, he explicitly recognizes Henry and Alex's love as genuine. So as we said, the king wants Henry's private feelings to be kept out of public view, at the same time that he seems remarkably tolerant and understanding of what those feelings are. And then as for the king's demeanor that we see in this final conversation that he has with Henry and Alex, the king shows avoidance and discomfort in dealing with the situation. He waits for more than a week to say anything at all about this scandal that's exploded into headlines. And then even when he goes into the meeting, he delays dealing with the actual problem at hand, and he relies on tobacco and alcohol in order to handle the situation. This echoes the ways we've seen earlier, both Henry and Alex relying upon alcohol to quell their anxiety and discomfort. And then in terms of how this scene is staged and fitted into the movie, there's the casting of Stephen Fry, who is an openly gay actor and who has become kind of an icon of gay advocacy in Great Britain. And I would argue also there's a very subtly campy style in which Fry plays the king. So if we take all of these elements and add them up together, you may see what I'm driving at, which is we have to consider, is King James III himself gay? I would say the clues point pretty strongly in that direction, and if we entertain this idea, this puts his behavior in a different light. For example, consider his expressions. When the subject of love actually comes up in this conversation, the king actually turns away from Henry and Alex. And in this way, this final confrontation in the movie can be seen as a generational conflict within the gay world. And many similar fights and conflicts like this have happened through the years among writers and artists and politicians over whether it should be acceptable for the younger gay generation to show their sexuality and their love life openly. And the scene here can be seen to echo in this way an incident in Matthew Lopez's play, The Inheritance, in which the older gay British writer E.M. Forster appears on stage as a character and gives advice to younger gay men. And while they do build some relationship, eventually, ultimately, these younger gay men dismiss E.M. Forster off the stage because he had lived his life in the closet, and hence, as he admits, he has nothing more to teach them. So this parallel, I think, shows how the movie, again in subtle ways, takes the dilemmas of a gay prince, this very sort of rarefied fantasy, and uses them to comment on gay history more broadly. And this is reinforced, I think, by various references and allusions in the movie that, for one thing, show Henry's awareness and his interest in gay and queer history beyond the royal family and his own sort of special dilemma as a gay prince. For example, as I mentioned in the introductory video, there are scenes of Henry listening to David Bowie and reading a novel by E.M. Forster. Then in the texting scene, when Alex and Henry are exchanging recommendations of books, Henry brings up The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, who was gay and who went to prison because of his same-sex affair. And on Alex's part, he cites the author James Baldwin, a gay American author, and specifically the novel Another Country, which happens to center on a bisexual main character, and which also can be seen as another variation on the international theme, because this main character for a time lives in Europe and then comes back and causes a stir, sort of disrupting the lives of his friends and associates back in New York. Now, probably the most revealing reference of all comes in the wedding scene in Buckingham Palace, when Alex approaches Henry, and Henry remarks that Alex seems to be enjoying himself, and Alex responds, of course, who doesn't love a little Mozart? And Henry then corrects him, saying, actually, it's Schubert. So this is noteworthy, firstly, in that Henry immediately identifies the song as Schubert. And that's significant because this is not among Schubert's most famous pieces. It happens to be the String Quartet No. 10 in E-flat major, which Franz Schubert wrote very early on in his life as a teenager. And it's not widely known today, but it was once popular, especially at weddings and family occasions, because it's relatively simple and easy for small orchestras to play at home gatherings. And so Henry, knowing this song right away, is reminiscent then of the allusion to David Bowie, where we saw Henry listening to Bowie's relatively obscure song Up the Hill Backwards. So just as that suggests that Henry is an avid Bowie fan, likewise Henry recognizing this piece suggests that he might be as if he knows that he should just ignore Alex's mistake, but he can't help pointing it out. And this is ambiguous. Why is Henry so irked by Alex's error, and why does he feel forced to correct it? Is his disgust simply towards Alex's lack of culture in general, thus emphasizing Henry's pretentiousness? Or rather, is it towards the slighting of Schubert in particular? So why would Henry be especially concerned about defending Schubert's reputation? Well, firstly, Schubert was relatively unheralded in his lifetime. Only one public concert of his works was ever held before he died at the age of only 31. And Schubert was overshadowed in his time in the musical world of Vienna, first by Mozart, whose work was the most popular and pervasive at the time when Schubert was growing up in the early 1800s, and then later in his life by Beethoven, his older contemporary, who died just the year before Schubert did. And Beethoven and his music specifically were much more bombastic than Schubert or his work. Beethoven was a kind of rock star of 1820s Vienna, and Schubert's work was comparatively more understated. And perhaps even more importantly, Schubert himself was very private. He never married, nor had any known liaisons with women, and he spent his whole adult life in a fairly secretive social circle of mainly gay artists and musicians in Vienna, and the evidence makes it seem very likely that Schubert himself was also gay. Hence, it makes sense that Henry might identify with Schubert, for one thing as a closeted gay man with an intensely private emotional and personal life, and even more specifically as one who is likely to feel overshadowed as the so-called spare, especially when at his heterosexual elder brother's wedding. So these sorts of allusions, like this mention of Schubert, give some hint as to how Henry understands himself, and other references and contexts also suggest how Henry, growing up, came to recognize and understand his own sexuality. Firstly, there's the reference to an English boarding school. So in Victorian and 20th century Britain, the British upper class mostly educated their sons in elite boys' boarding schools. And for many years it has been basically an open secret that sexual experimentation among boys is common at these schools. And the effects of gender, class, and political power basically made this practice unofficially accepted. Those who have watched Downton Abbey might remember it's alluded to even in that show. So Lord Grantham supposedly went to Eton, which is possibly the most exclusive English boarding school associated particularly with the royal family. It's located in Windsor, just down the road from Windsor Castle. And in one episode of Downton Abbey, a sort of scandal breaks out in the household when a male servant tries to kiss one of his male colleagues, and Lord Grantham simply shrugs this off, saying, quote, "I mean, if I shouted blue murder every time someone tried to kiss me at Eton, I'd have gone hoarse in a month," end quote. Now, secondly, and more importantly, we get clues as to how Henry came to understand his sexuality through the references to classical antiquity. So, homosexuality has been a deeply taboo subject in many periods through history, and it is often confusing then and disorienting for gay people to realize their own sexual feelings. But classical antiquity is, in a sense, always there. Anyone who encounters classical art or great Greek and Roman writers such as Sappho or Horace, or Plato's dialogues, or the histories of ancient rulers like Hadrian, will know about same-sex love and attraction. And this history is subtly invoked in the movie. For one thing, Alex's name is arguably in part an allusion to Alexander the Great, an ancient ruler and warrior who had male lovers. And historically, it's not surprising that many of the great classical scholars, including the first pioneering archaeologist of ancient Greek art, Johann Winckelmann, were gay. And in Britain, anyone educated at Oxford or Cambridge would know about classical history and literature. And some gay and lesbian scholars have always been drawn into this world and become classicists. One great example is the British poet and Latin scholar A.E. Housman from the turn of the century, who bears a lot of resemblances to Henry, and who I might go back to and talk about more next time. Another fictional reference to this history is found in E.M. Forster's gay novel titled Morris, which he wrote in the 1910s, but which was only published many years later after his death in the 1970s. And this novel by Forster, the same author who wrote Howard's End, follows two Cambridge students who fall in love at the same time that they are learning about what their classics professors call, quote, the unspeakable vice of the Greeks. So Henry, too, seems to fall into this long tradition of gay awakenings in encountering the classics. So when he and Alex go to the Victoria and Albert Museum, Henry describes his childhood visits to the museum as a formative experience, while at the same time on screen we are seeing images of idealized athletic male bodies in the Greco-Roman style. And furthermore, it's pretty clearly indicated that this experience of seeing this classical and neoclassical art was connected to Henry's sexual awakening, since he says that he used to imagine bringing someone he loves here to the museum, and he calls this, quote, a daft pubescent fantasy. And later in the scene when Henry and Alex do dance here in the sculpture gallery, in the long shot we see the two lovers framed by ancient and neoclassical sculptures. More specifically, they are bracketed on both sides, in front and behind, by two monumental sculptures, both of them by the Italian neoclassical artist Antonio Canova. So in front of them we see his sculpture of the Three Graces, and behind them Theseus and the Minotaur. Antonio Canova was known for finely detailed, sensuous depictions of human bodies, often with erotic overtones. One famous example is his massive sculpture of Perseus, which is located at the Met in New York. And he often put this sensuous detailing into group sculptures with figures of the same sex in poses with erotic overtones. For instance, if we look at his sculpture of the Three Graces, It was traditional to show these figures as three women, with the central figure draping her arms over her two companions to the right and left. In Canova's version, which we see in the scene in Red, White, and Royal Blue, their pose is especially close and intimate. The central figure and the left are nuzzling their heads together as if they are about to kiss or have just kissed, and the right figure, not to be left out, has her hand placed right on the central figure's bosom. So this is an especially erotically charged scene. And then as for the Theseus and the Minotaur sculpture, which is the one that Alex actually places his phone in front of when he plays the music, Canova's sculpture of Theseus and the Minotaur depicts these two figures from the ancient legend of the hero Theseus, who finds and kills the Minotaur, a half-human monster with the head of a bull. And bulls, of course, are often used as symbols of virility. And Canova's sculpture shows the two figures apparently spent and exhausted after their fight, with the Minotaur lying on his back, hips thrust upward, and Theseus straddling him with his muscles flexed. Need I say more? And the appearance of these sculptures in the museum scene shows how the classics could offer a context and a language for same-sex attraction and eroticism, especially for members of the educated upper classes. So this is the world and the experience that Henry is coming from when he then encounters Alex. And all of this then is important to the structure and allegorical meaning of the story, because the fact that these two lovers are the same sex serves to emphasize their other differences, which become more salient, their different personalities and backgrounds, race and class, and most of all, of course, nationality. And it also makes it possible at the same time for the two to interact as presumptively equal representatives of their respective countries. There's no gender difference encoding a traditional hierarchical relationship between them. And this is very important because so much of American national identity, historically, has been defined in relation with and in contrast to Great Britain, which of course is the country that the US was formed in order to break away from. And more specifically, the American identity has been shaped and performed through the American presidency, which was created as a symbolic counterpart to the British monarchy. So lastly now, I want to talk about the historical background and context to Alex's position as the so-called first son of the United States, and the importance of his connection to the presidency and all of its symbolism. So the American presidency was first created in the federal constitution, largely to serve as a counterpart to the British crown, and the status of the presidency was really uncertain and contested from the start. And for example, John Adams, who served as the first vice president, actually wanted for the president to be formally addressed as Your Majesty, but eventually just Mr. President was settled on. And this was part of a larger debate about the meaning of the revolution. What was the point of American independence? Was it for America to become a new power like Great Britain, as Federalists like John Adams wanted? Or was it to become something entirely different, a yeoman's republic, like Jefferson and his allies wanted, and to set up America as a contrast to Great Britain? And one of the really zealous partisans in these fights over the meaning of the American Republic was Alexander Hamilton. And there are many references to Hamilton in both the book of Red, White, and Royal Blue and in the movie. For instance, in the Red Room scene, where Alex and Henry have their first tryst, we see a portrait of Hamilton on the wall, and it sort of faces and reflects Alex, almost like his own reflection in the mirror. And then we see Hamilton sort of watching the two lovers again in the hallway as they walk out of the Red Room. As other critics have pointed out, the book of Red, White, and Royal Blue was written in the wake of the sensation over the musical Hamilton, and it can be seen in some ways as an instance of sort of pop culture Hamiltonianism, this revival of Hamilton as a national symbol, which can be sort of related to the pop culture royalism that I referred to in the last video. So Hamilton himself was the arch-federalist, and he was the most strongly in favor of America imitating Great Britain and creating a strong national state with a large army and navy, a strong presidency. Hamilton advocated that the president should be elected for life and should have all kinds of powers, such as the ability to appoint the governors of the various states. And it seems that he even entertained the idea of making the United States into an outright monarchy. So in 1786, just before the federal constitution was drafted, Nathaniel Gorham, the president of the Continental Congress, sent a message offering to the Prince of Prussia to come to the United States and take up a throne, to become the King of America. And very likely Hamilton was involved and approved of this plot. As it happens, what was the name of this Prussian prince that Gorham and his compatriots invited to come take up rulership in America? His name was Henry. Now, that aside, there are many connections between Alexander Hamilton and our Alex in Red, White, and Royal Blue. Alex was named after Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton also came from a modest background, the illegitimate son of a peddler. He had a foreign origin. Hamilton was born in St. Kitts in the West Indies, but nonetheless he rose to power and prominence. He was seen as a kind of wunderkind, highly ambitious and impetuous. He was the subject of the nation's first sex scandal, so you can see that as a kind of foreshadowing of Alex's affair with Henry and their exposure. And Hamilton was also famously insecure about his height. And we see over and over again that our Alex is obsessed with his height, especially relative to Henry. He twice insists that Henry is not 6'2". He resents the implication that he's shorter than Henry. And interestingly, at the wedding at Buckingham Palace, Alex accuses Henry of looking down on people. And Henry retorts, in your case, I'd say it's inevitable. Alex immediately gets the subtext and insists we are the same height. So Alex's height insecurity can reflect, and you could say symbolize, broader status anxiety relative to Henry, which is expressed right from the very beginning of the movie. For instance, in the opening scene in the limo, when Alex explicitly says he feels less prepared for formal occasions like this wedding, and that he dislikes being compared to Henry. It makes him feel inadequate. And later on at Kensington Palace, when the two are forced to meet and pose as friends, there is the handshake scene with a great deal of sexual undertones. And Alex points out to Henry that his NDA, his non-disclosure agreement, is bigger than Henry's. And in reply, Henry correctly clocks that Alex is wearing lifts. So this is folded in to Alex's general status anxiety. And Alex's insecurity relative to Henry reflects also his ambiguous role and status as a president's son. So the presidency has always been the symbolic flashpoint of a contradiction, right? This unresolved tension over what sort of state America should be, how it should relate and represent itself to the rest of the world. The presidency and all of its ceremony must appear equal to the old royal courts of Europe, but at the same time totally different. The Republic wants to project the same dignity as European states, while supposedly being more democratic, egalitarian, and individualistic. And this paradox leads to constant tension, which is embodied too in part by the building of the White House. So the White House is a critical symbol in American national iconography and mythology. It embodies a lot of this ambivalence and inner conflict about the American identity. And in the movie, the White House is the most common and frequent setting. But more than that, it functions almost like a character. It's seen sort of looming, almost watching at critical moments, whether directly, like in the South Ground scenes, or indirectly through prints on the wall. And I'll talk about that more later in a later video. But the current version of the White House that we know today was mostly designed in the 1810s by the First Lady Dolly Madison and the architect Benjamin Latrobe, who wanted to create a sort of Republican court which would be grand and impressive with long galleries like a Renaissance palace, but at the same time more clear and open, so that the presidency and high officials could be seen and approached by visitors, even members of the public, unlike in a traditional royal court, where there would be sort of rarefied closed spaces like the throne room, where the monarch would receive dignitaries. And the White House since then has been frequently extended and remodeled through the years, vacillating between periods of greater extravagance and periods of simplicity and restraint. For example, there was greater opulence in the Gilded Age, which was then stripped out in favor of a more austere style in the Progressive period after 1900. And the name that we use, White House, this only came into usage at this time in 1901 under President Theodore Roosevelt, a progressive politician. And it's really a euphemism for what is actually a palace. The White House was originally called the Presidential Palace. And this is explicitly pointed out in the movie when Alex complains to his father about Henry and complains he is privileged, elite, and lives in a palace. His father points out, well, you're in the same position. You're now privileged and elite and live in a palace. So there's this constant contradiction, right? This tension. Are we exactly like them, or do we stand in contrast and contradistinction to them, to the royals of the old world? And at different times, especially in the last century or so, new royal overtones and styles have been brought in to the White House, ironically often by more liberal and progressive presidents. For example, JFK and his wife Jackie Kennedy oversaw a remodeling and redecoration of the White House, making it more fashionable and glamorous. And this came to be seen as a sort of golden moment in the history of the presidency, and the JFK administration came to be called Camelot. It has this sort of romantic mystique to it, linked, again, to Arthur, to the Arthur mythos. This has happened many times, that this sort of royal aura and similarities to the British royal family often attaches to progressive presidents who advocate and pursue ambitious policies, which is possible using the new powers of the presidency and the new visibility through mass media. The biggest example of this is FDR, who was an upper-class blue blood, but who pursued populist policies in the New Deal period, was able to appear normal, human, approachable, using new media, especially the radio, in his so-called fireside chats, which evoked a similar sense of family domesticity, much like the British royals were doing in the same period, where they wanted to appear as kind of the nation's family. And in Red, White, and Royal Blue, when we see the Oval Office, we actually see the portrait of FDR placed right over the fireplace, in an apparent allusion to these fireside chats. So the movie captures some of this paradoxical relationship between the British crown and the presidency, which have to be similar enough to be equal in dignity, but at the same time totally different. For example, this is really emphasized in the contrast between the two party scenes. First, the Buckingham Palace wedding reception in London, and then the White House New Year's Eve party. So the White House New Year's Eve party is arguably in some sense more cool, more hip. It's certainly more lively and youthful in contrast to the stuffy royal wedding. But at the same time, it's just as glitzy and extravagant. And I would say it looks much like a scene in the Capital District in the Hunger Games. And these are really just two different styles of wretched excess. And alongside the White House as a sort of lasting symbol, the so-called First Family, or these various families that cycle in and out of the White House, they also embody the ambiguity and the paradoxical role of the American presidency. And firstly, the role of First Lady is this sort of weird title for the president's wife. This was initially just an informal phrase, a term for the highest-ranking social hostess in Washington, but it was gradually given its own sort of weird quasi-official status after 1900, with its own press team and security, and this was then gradually extended to the president's children and other family members as well. And the family is important to this sort of performative sense of domesticity, which in turn is borrowed from the British royal family. And the first family came to serve as sort of similar symbols of the nation as a domestic entity. But also at the same time, in theory, America doesn't have any royalty or aristocracy. And the first family are not elected, they serve no legal or constitutional purpose, and they are still technically private citizens, even as they live in this sort of rarefied bubble. And hence there is this contradiction and ambiguity in the role of the first family, which can be seen as similar to the ambiguous and contradictory role of royalty in what is really now a modern liberal democracy like Great Britain. And this contradiction is made explicit when Alex is instructed to go to Great Britain for photo ops with Henry, and when Alex complains that the royals are merely figureheads, Zara retorts, quote, "unlike you, whose role is clearly spelled out in Article Nothing of the U.S. Constitution." So this parallel is set up right from the beginning. And it's alluded to again in a very subtle way in the White House New Year's Eve scene, specifically in the later part when the two lovers have their first kiss. So after midnight, Henry is dejected. He steps out of the party tent into the White House South grounds. And as the scene is described in the book, he goes and leans against a linden tree to look at the stars. In the movie, it is a bit different. It's a snowy night, not clear, and Alex tracks Henry down and finds him standing under the branches of a wide-spreading conifer, which naturally offers some shelter in the snow as well as some degree of privacy. And we learn that Henry has been thinking about his wish to live an ordinary private life as an ordinary person, or in his words, quote, "an anonymous person in the world." And the setting here, I think, is very significant. The tree under which this exchange and the kiss take place seems as if it is probably intended to represent the Atlas cedar, which is a large, wide-spreading conifer on the south grounds of the White House, which was planted sometime in the 19th century, and which enjoyed a sort of 15 minutes of fame in the 1970s, when President Carter built a platform treehouse under the tree's branches for his 10-year-old daughter, Amy Carter, who reportedly used it for sleepovers with her friends, held still under the watchful eye of the Secret Service. And so the setting under this tree evokes the strange attempt to recreate a sort of simulacrum of ordinary family life and of ordinary youth, while in the extraordinary and rarefied environment of the White House. So this awkwardness and the paradoxical role of the first family comes into play and into stark relief in relation to what you could say is the real thing, the original, the British royal family. So the interactions between Alex and Henry are bound to be very fraught. And the movie represents, on the one hand, American national anxiety as the kind of wayward child that can never fully break away from and can never measure up to the so-called mother country, which is Great Britain. And this is seen in Alex's anxiety, his fear of inadequacy, which Henry at some moments tries to assuage, and at other moments he plays upon and intensifies. For example, when they visit the hospital, Henry evidently notices Alex's anxiety and seems to try to put Alex at ease by introducing him to the children in the hospital by saying, quote, "his mum outranks my mum." But nonetheless, later on in the affair, when the two of them are more comfortable and tease each other freely, Henry, you could say, pushes Alex's buttons by acting aghast when he learns that Alex has not seen Henry's favorite movie, and he remarks, "Sometimes I forget how uncultured you Americans are." So he seems to know that this is still Alex's vulnerability. And Alex, for his part, does dish it back, but in a fairly gentle way. And after getting to know Henry, he tends to deal with him very delicately. In the lake scene, he makes fun of Henry's accent, but his main mode of teasing Henry is calling him, quote, "your majesty," which serves to puncture Henry's pretensions, both as a royal and as a Briton. And I would say also, as an aside, it's one of several hints that I think foreshadow that Henry will in fact be king, since your majesty is the title for the king. But ultimately we can see Alex's attitude towards Henry is mainly protective, and his journey of sort of accepting Henry and becoming his protector echoes America's evolving relationship with Great Britain. Over the course of the 19th century, Britain's former colony grew into a rival industrial and military power. In the 20th century, it became a crucial ally of Great Britain and ended up playing a critical role in arming and supplying Great Britain in their struggle against the Nazis, and finally in delivering victory in the last 2 years of World War II. So this dramatic reversal fuels a different kind of status anxiety on each side of this alliance. On the part of Great Britain, there is gratitude on the surface, but with a clear undercurrent of resentment. And on the part of America, there is gloating on the surface, but a continuing quiet desperation for approval. A sense that Americans might actually be saying, do we finally measure up now that we've saved your butt? And so this is the tension, you could say, in the mid-20th century, which I think is captured very well in another film from about 60 years earlier than Red, White, and Royal Blue, and which forms an interesting forerunner and counterpart to this movie, and that is the Americanization of Emily, which came out in 1964, and it was based on a very racy novel, which had to be cleaned up a bit for the screen. And it deals with the relationship between an American naval officer and a British military driver. It takes place in 1944 during the preparations for D-Day, and the American officer, Charlie Madison, who's played by James Garner, is assigned as a handler for an American admiral, and has to keep him and his staff supplied with food, liquor, and female companionship. And it's understood from the beginning that there is an exchange going on. And the term Americanization actually took on a specific meaning at this time during World War II. It was used as a euphemism for American servicemen, especially officers, luring British women into sexual relationships in return for money, protection, and especially rationed goods like high-end clothing, food, liquor, perfume, etc. And Charlie Madison in the movie is shrewd, and he understands that it is not just sex, but also prestige or cultural capital that the British women offer to these American officers. You can see this in a scene where Charlie describes the sort of woman that he wants to introduce to the admiral.
I need a girl, Sheila. A bright, bridge-playing girl. Very crusty, elegant, British diction calculated to bring out the upstart in any American.
So Charlie explicitly understands that Americans are always, in some sense, upstarts, who cannot help desiring the status that comes from acceptance in the old world, especially as represented by women. Meanwhile, the British driver that he has an affair with, Emily Barham, she's played by Julie Andrews. She's a widow who has also lost her brother in the war, and outwardly she is seen as a moralistic prig, but it turns out that she is also very sentimental and romantic in her private feelings. And you can see some similarity here, I think, to Henry. And Emily resents that the Americans have made much less sacrifice in this war than the British have, and that they're indulging in entertainment and rationed goods that are forbidden for Britons. And she remarks that for the Americans, the war is just one big Shriners convention. Ironically, she's attracted to Charlie. She's drawn in by his swagger and free-spiritedness, but she resists entering into a transactional relationship with him. And for instance, when Charlie goes to her home and brings her chocolate bars, she refuses them, saying, "Don't Americanize me, Charlie."
And I don't want oranges or eggs or soapflakes either. Don't show me how profitable it'll be to fall in love with you, Charlie. Don't Americanize me.
So the relationship between the two is always strained. And the affair between Charlie and Emily is used as a symbol of the shifting relationship between the US and Great Britain, with Britain here cast in the feminine role. And in fact, hardly any British men or any American women appear in the whole movie. And the mother country, in a sense, can be seen to shift into more of a wife role. Now then, if we compare to Red, White, and Royal Blue, this comes out 59 years later, at a time when the U.S. is clearly the most powerful Western nation, the guarantor of security of Western and Central Europe, and in turn, Britain serves as America's ally and specifically as America's bridgehead into Europe, helping to maintain American influence and to keep all of Western and Central Europe in the American sphere of influence. But this British role as a bridgehead has now been undermined by Brexit. So this throws into doubt what had been apparently a sort of transactional relationship between the two countries. And in the aftermath of Brexit, some within Britain advocated that the British should replace the EU market with closer ties to the United States, hence leading perhaps to a closer economic bond between these two countries. And as it happens in Red, White, and Royal Blue, we see that Britain and the US are actually in process of negotiating a new trade deal. So in sum, Red, White, and Royal Blue seems to capture a moment in this ambiguity and fluidity in the relationship between the US and Britain, the possibility of a closer economic relationship, even as British political usefulness to the United States, geopolitically speaking, is in doubt. And hence it is fitting that in Red, White, and Royal Blue, the relationship is symbolized by a same-sex affair. So the relationship is not structured by traditional or stereotypical gender roles. Both of the lovers are men, and so the terms of this relationship are improvised and changing. And in the world of the movie, the relationship is politically and legally ambiguous. It's unclear how it will help or hurt either of the men in terms of public favor or perception. It's unclear if it can possibly lead to a marriage. And remember, the marriage of any member of the royal family requires royal assent. And even if it does lead to a marriage, we don't know how that would affect Henry's standing in the line of succession, and it's unclear whether Alex can effectively protect Henry as he might wish to do, and provide the privacy and security that Henry desires. But nonetheless, we can see a kind of transaction is enacted between them. Alex gets the status and prestige of being associated with Great Britain and with royalty. He no longer has to worry about measuring up to Henry now that Henry has, in a sense, extended his patronage to Alex by accepting his love and protection. And Henry in turn gets freedom from the constricting environment of the royal family. And more broadly, you could say from the old world. He's offered a place of belonging, which is more open, more fluid, to replace the loss of the crown's protection, which you could see as symbolically alluded to in the imaginary tower that Alex accuses Henry of shutting himself in Kensington Palace. So in all of these senses, at the end, one could say that Henry has been Americanized, in much the same way that the UK since World War II has been Americanized, by accepting American suzerainty and also American popular culture, only to, in a sense, dish it back, producing many of the biggest stars of the exact genres like rock music and movies that define American culture. So in sum, this movie, based on an American book and directed by an American, but filmed in Great Britain, can be seen as an American fantasy of gaining affirmation from Great Britain, in part by liberating Britain from the old world, and more specifically, in this case, of freeing Britain from itself, from its imprisonment in its own tower. But also, once again, the story of Red, White, and Royal Blue cannot be reduced to its historical or political symbolism. It also has a real personal and psychological dimension as the story of the affair between two individuals and their personalities, their fears, their desires. I referred to it before as a sort of imaginary garden with real toads in it. That is what I hope to get to next in the next video, the romance of Alex and Henry in Red, White, and Royal Blue, before I then go on to other aspects, to the visual and symbolic language, the politics, and ultimately what this movie says about movies, art, aesthetics. So I'll say thank you once again to the Red, White, and Royal Blue fan community, and to the 300 plus patrons of Historiansplaining who made it possible to start this whole endeavor. And if you want to see this video and others after it without ads right when they're finished, please go to my Patreon page. The link is in the description, and become a patron of Historiansplaining at any level. Thank you.